All right. So John, within vSAN, of course, we've built in these abilities to be able to tolerate failure. Well, what happens when there's too many failures in a vSAN cluster?
So let's say you design for RAID 1, which is able to tolerate up to one failure by design, or RAID 5 up to one failure. But let's say you have more failures than that. Um, so let's say you've got a cluster that's maybe it's 10 nodes. It's worth noting, if I have two hosts that fail, if one fails or one drive fails, and then there's an amount of time elapses and then another failure happens, there's actually a decent chance that I was able to rebuild into the existing free space. So I don't have hot spares in a vSAN cluster. All of my slack space, all of my extra space that's sitting there, sitting idle, that is my hot spare effectively. And so if you have a drive fail on Friday, there's no need to rush to the data center. You can get it after the weekend, because assuming you had enough raw space in that cluster, you'll just see the raw space diminish temporarily as it uses that for repair. Now, what happens if I exceed the design and I have the worst case happen? So I have two hosts completely fail simultaneously, no time for repair operation in my 10 node cluster. What happens to my poor little virtual machine that was only designed for one failure? Well, it might survive. In fact, it probably will survive. So assuming this is a little 100 GB VM, I don't have a stripe policy, it's just going to be two components and a witness component. Now, the odds of both of those failures impacting two of those three components is actually not the majority. In fact, the larger the cluster gets, the odds actually increase of any given one VM surviving. Now, there may be some VMs that don't survive, but it actually becomes, you get kind of an exponential effect of, it's a smaller and smaller percentage of the cluster that you basically get lucky. Now, there are some things that would diminish that. If you had stripe, if you had very large objects that had chunked out into a lot of components, there'd be some more risk. But for your typical VMs, no stripe policy, 255 gigabytes, you're just going to get luckier and luckier. In fact, there's a blog on this topic, scale up vSAN to scale down failure. There's a nice little chart there that illustrates this. But this is something to think about. Now, please don't design for this and say, well, I have to be able to survive two failures. I'm only going to ever use RAID 1, RAID 5. But do realize that it's subsequent failures, especially if they're spaced out, or concurrent failures that exceed design tolerances in a large cluster. Yes, you might have to restore some things from backup, but it might be a very small amount. And do remember, if those hosts, let's say the motherboards just died, and that's the VM going unavailable, the drives are still healthy. If you go get your 4-hour parts, you swap the motherboards, you bring them back up, vSAN's back, you've regained a quorum again. You haven't lost data, you just lost availability. Now the virtual machines can be fired back on. So there's quite a bit of resiliency even when you exceed planned tolerances.
Sure, sure. And I would imagine too, when we think about the fact that, we can set these planned levels of failures to tolerate, that since that's on a per object basis, that in fact, you can have more than that, the number of prescribed failures occur on other hosts, and it really doesn't apply to those objects. I mean, that level of prescription only applies for the host that those objects live on. And so it's sort of an interesting thing, because we don't necessarily wide stripe the data across all of the hosts in the vSAN cluster, and it's really a great side effect of that.
Yeah, and this is very different from kind of your traditional two controller modular storage array, to where if one of those controllers was in maintenance, the other one failed, or both of them failed, everything goes down. It's an all or nothing. Or if you design that wide stripe storage pool for a giant RAID 10, and you had two drives fail, everything was gone, and now you're potentially restoring hundreds of terabytes of data. This is a very different failure mode on exceeding tolerances.